Baking bread is one of the easiest things you can do at home, whether it's today or 250 years ago. So many people today and in the 18th century relied on the baker to supply them bread. That might be because they thought bread was difficult to make, or possibly because the ingredients were expensive. But the reality is that at least today, baking bread is inexpensive, it's very easy, everyone can afford the fuel, and it produces a better product if we make it at home. Today I'm going to show you how to bake bread exactly like they did in the 18th century. All the same rules apply and all the same ingredients. We talked about the baker many times on this channel in the past, and the baker is so very important in the 18th century. He is not only supplying bread to the population, but also things like yeast and flour, and he supplies ovens. People can take their things to the baker to have them baked. But in the 18th century, something else is going on. There's a problem with supplying bread to everyone possible. And there's this encouragement, especially by the government of Great Britain, for people to bake their own bread, to become more self-reliant because of the upheaval that they were having at the time. So many people are moving from an agricultural situation to a more industrialized situation, and that is causing problems within society. There isn't enough wheat to go around. We need more substitutes for bread, is what the people are saying. So the government and other scientific thinkers of the time period are looking at this problem and trying to find solutions. I really based most of what we're going to talk about here on Edlund's book about the art of baking in the 18th century, or bread making. He is really a scientific thinker of the time period. He talks about looking at all the different aspects of bread. Specifically, how did they grow wheat? How did they store it? How did they grind it? What's really going on with wheat, and why does it act differently than so many of these other grains? Why does it work great for making bread that we think of today? And then he goes in depth into alternatives and why they work and why they don't work and why they're less expensive. And he even has chapters about what the bakehouse looks like and what the baker is doing from minute to minute in his working day. So there's a lot of information in a book like this. It was printed in 1804, just the time period that we're talking about, where at the end of the 18th century, there's this societal upheaval in Europe, in Great Britain. Things like the French Revolution, right, are partly driven by the lack of bread that people have access to. Not so much in North America, but we still have our own situations in that time period. He's looking for solutions, and he gives us a lot of information. There are many recipes in this cookbook for bread, but we're gonna start off with this most simple one, and he calls it a common family way of making bread. Now, it's hilarious because it starts off with a half a bushel of flour. A common family here is starting with 20 pounds of flour, right? And he's talking about baking bread here for a week or for 2 weeks at a time. Or maybe their family must be really big. Obviously, we don't need 20 pounds of bread here. So we're gonna take this recipe, we're gonna shrink it way down. We start off with 2 pounds of flour, and there's even sort of controversy about the flour in the 18th century versus flour today. It's obviously a very different kind of grain, especially flour from Great Britain to, say, North America. I would say that our closest substitute for 18th century flour is one of the easiest ones for us to find, which is all-purpose flour. It's not got the super high gluten content of a bread flour. It's just kind of a middling flour. And that's just fine. We want to use something that's an unbleached, all-purpose flour. We're going to be mixing here today in our dough bowl, which is very common for the time period, or in a larger situation, they had a big wooden trough is what they did. It was almost like a table, except it was 2 feet deep and had wood sides all the way around, and they would mix the dough in that. The baker would do the same thing in a very large version. He might be doing 200 pounds at a time. We're gonna pile in our 2 pounds of all-purpose flour, and then make a little hole in the center of it. This is the traditional way to do it, and all the recipes call for that. We just make a little divot in the center. It kind of looks like a volcano here with the hole in the middle. And into that, we're gonna pour a little bit of salt here. He talks about 6 ounces of salt in this 20 pounds of flour. So if we shrink that down by 10%, we want, maybe a little bit more than a half an ounce of salt. You want to use a nice quality salt. I wouldn't use an iodized salt in this situation. I'd use a nice sea salt or something like that. And then we're going to pour in our yeast. Now, this is liquid yeast, but basically it's just regular powdered yeast that we have added water to and a little bit of flour and just kind of let it do its thing for an hour or so. It doesn't take any great quantity. If we're doing this 2 pounds, we will just need like a full packet of modern yeast. We can put that, if we really want to, dry right into the center of our pile of flour. And then we're gonna add in our water. He talks about 6 quarts of water in our 20 pounds or so. We're gonna take that down to about a pint of water. Now, it really depends on your flour here about exactly how much water you're gonna add. A pint, a little bit more. Make sure to have a little bit more water on hand and a little bit of flour that you haven't used yet, because as you start to mix it, you might not get to exactly the right consistency. And the other thing that's really, really important here is the temperature of our situation. So this is summertime here. The temperature in this building is about 75 or 80 degrees. This is kind of warm for baking bread. He talks about certain circumstances where if you're in the winter time, you want your water to be warmer, maybe very warm. And temperature is really important to the yeast part of it. If yeast isn't warm enough, it just won't do anything. It won't be active. And if you get it too hot, say you pour in water that's too hot, you will kill the yeast. And again, it won't do anything. So you want to hit that kind of perfect spot. Different yeasts have different temperature kind of curves to them, but if you're hitting this 75 to 80 degrees, the yeast will love it. It'll take off and just go crazy. In his recipe, he mixes up the flour, the yeast, and the water, and he sets the sponge. He basically lets it set for a while, an hour and a half or so in that state before he kneads it. Then he gets into the kneading part, and he says, after an hour and a half or more or less, according to the state of the weather, knead it well together, be not sparing of the labor. And one of the things we're doing here as we knead it isn't just mixing it up. It does do that. It does change the consistency and make sure that all the components are stretched out together, but it's also activating what's happening here in the flour itself. So it's activating the gluten that's stringing all these things together, and it changes what's happening with the dough itself. We want that to happen. So we do want a lot of kneading here, and you can see how stiff it is. So that was the whole point of, having a little extra flour, a little extra water. We want to have this to have a nice kind of soft doughy consistency, not too stiff, and not so that it's sort of runny in the trough here. Now, there are 18th century breads that don't take a lot of kneading. They're specifically called French breads. They're enriched, they have other ingredients, and you don't need them because you want them to have a different sort of texture. But this, we want to have a nice kind of stiffer texture that holds a lot of these air bubbles. So we want to have some good kneading to our dough. You don't have to go crazy. Your bread will still be good if you don't knead it a whole bunch. That's what I mean by this is pretty easy. In fact, it is very easy to do. And the more you do it, the easier it'll get for you. But even the rank beginner will still make a great bread. We've let our dough rise here, and it really depends on the temperature outside or inside where you're letting it rise. It might take an hour, a couple hours. It will definitely start to really puff up. What I'm gonna do is break this in half. I'm gonna tear it in half basically and form up 2 loaves. And I will go ahead and let them kind of do their own thing for a little bit, and then they'll go into the oven. So what is bread? Now, bread in the 18th century is very specifically defined. It has 4 ingredients. This was by law. Bread has flour in it, wheat flour usually. It has yeast, it has salt, and it has water. That is it. If there are other ingredients in bread, then that would be against the law. The baker might be run out of town or fined or whatever it is, whatever the punishment was in that particular situation. Now, if you look at a bread package today, you're going to find other ingredients in bread. We've decided to add all kinds of crazy things to bread, but in the 18th century, that's what bread is, and that's what really bread is today. So out of our 4 bread ingredients, 2 are very easy to understand. Salt, yes, we want salt in our bread, and if we really wanted to make our bread without salt, we could do that. Water, that seemed very, very simple, although the quality of water makes a lot of difference in our bread. You want to use the best kind of water, and some of these recipes in the 18th century talk about specifically kinds of water to use, like soft water instead of hard well water. But flour and yeast are the 2 ingredients that really make bread, and they're the ones that are sometimes the hardest to get our head around. Now, flour. In most of these recipes, we're going to be using wheat flour, and wheat flour is important because it has gluten in it. And gluten is this kind of fibrous goo that's inside of flour that really holds the air bubbles in and gives us this light and fluffy bread that we expect. There are breads all over the world, and even breads in the 18th century that were basically unleavened, very hard, stiff breads, difficult to eat. Say like ship's biscuit, where it's so hard you could break your teeth on it. That doesn't have any yeast in it, and it doesn't have any air pockets. There are other flours in the 18th century that he talks about as substitutes that don't, he even says, it's like, well, this just doesn't have the right kind of thing. It doesn't hold the air bubbles and it makes a really dense bread. But yeast is a very special thing that's happening in the 18th century. They had yeast. They usually got it from the brewer. They would call it barm. They might call it yeast. It was in a liquid form. This is yeast that as you're brewing a batch of beer, it floats to the top. It's sort of a frothy or a slimy mixture that is not like the clear beer that you're trying to make. Now, this yeast is special stuff. In fact, it's so special that they had no idea what it was in the 18th century. They knew what it did and how to use it, but they certainly didn't know what it constituted. Why did it do what it does? And they don't really learn about that until the mid to late 19th century, when they can actually study it under a microscope and understand that it's actually a living organism. It's doing something special, it's alive. But in the 18th century, they had no idea that that's what it was happening. They had all these interesting concepts about fixed air, and that's why so many of the recipes for beer and even bread, they might boil the ingredients for a long period of time because they think they're putting air into the water. But of course, that's not what's happening at all. Yeast is a living organism that is eating up the sugars in the flour and whatever else, if you have other sort of sweeteners inside of the dough. And it's creating alcohol and it's creating carbon dioxide bubbles. That's what's happening. It's a living organism that's doing its thing. And that's why it takes a particular kind of time for it to leaven whatever it's leavening, because it has to work. It has to eat up things and have that carbon dioxide come out and make the bubbles, and those bubbles are caught in the gluten of the flour. So it's a very special thing. People have been using yeast for thousands of years. They talk about the yeast that's in the dough bowls in the Exodus in the Bible. And the brewers, they're using yeast. Sometimes early on, they don't know why the things are forming, but say by the 13th or 14th century, they've got a real good concept of what the yeast is doing, how to capture it, how to propagate it, how to use it in the brewing of beer. And at that time, it starts to be used also in the baking of bread as an added ingredient. Now today, when you're baking, probably every single one of you is going to go out and you're going to buy a packet of yeast or a little tiny jar. In the 18th century, yes, they're going to be using a liquid yeast. They're going to get this batch from the brewer. This next recipe is almost as easy, and this is the classic bread for North America. He talks in his book about the use of maize, or Indian corn as it was known in the 18th century, And he has recipes for it, but none of them are exactly like this one. This is a standard thirded bread. So it is made up of 1/3 cornmeal, 1/3 rye flour, and 1/3 wheat flour. This makes an almost loaf of bread. Corn is difficult to use in a bread because it has no gluten, and so it really kind of fights the whole point of our standard bread. Now we make regular cornbread today, and we use an artificial leavening, a chemical leavening that kind of puffs it up a little bit. But no matter what you do with corn, it's going to be a lot more dense. Now what I've got here is a standard medium grind cornmeal, but for this recipe it needs to be boiled. It really needs to kind of absorb all that moisture. If we just put it in dry like that, it'll work, but it really won't work as well. So this has already been pre-boiled, doesn't take very long at all, like 3 minutes. And you just stir it into some boiling water. That will cause it to really absorb all that moisture and kind of mix into this dough much better. Since this is a thirded bread and we're going for 2 pounds of dough, we're gonna mix 12 ounces of regular unbleached flour, 12 ounces of rye flour, and 12 ounces of this cornmeal. Now that's the cornmeal before it's been boiled. It's gonna absorb a lot of moisture here. You're gonna have to measure that before you start boiling it. Once those are all together, I'm gonna go ahead and mix in the ingredients. You do wanna wait until this cornmeal is down to a not too hot temperature, say, regular 100 degrees or so, or else it'll be too hot and it'll kill your yeast. But once that's all mixed up together, it's not gonna knead in the same wonderful way that the regular just wheat flour is going to. It's gonna be a lot grittier. That's just the nature of the beast in this situation. Let's go ahead and cover this up and let it rise. It's not gonna rise nearly as much as our other regular wheat recipe, but we do wanna let it have some time to grow. For us, we're gonna be using the earthen oven outside. It's completely different than a modern oven. You stoke it up, you put fire in it, it's gonna go up to 900 degrees depending on what's happening here. And then we're gonna take all the coals out of it. We're gonna put the door on it and then let it cool off to baking temperature. So in a period oven, we start off at a really high temperature and it slowly goes down to a lower temperature depending on how big the oven is. The baker, he has a giant oven and it's gonna take basically a half a day to cool down, or even longer than that. So he's got all kinds of different things he's gonna bake. So he's gonna bake bread first, and then he's gonna bake cookies and other things that take a lower temperature. And then at the end of the day, he's gonna put his firewood inside the oven to dry it off for the next day. You're gonna be baking these in a modern oven, and it's super simple. All you have to do is preheat your oven to 350 degrees and put your bread loaves on a cookie sheet. Now you can put these on that sheet and then cover it up with plastic, let it proof a little bit and kind of puff up. Then it goes into the oven. If you wanna make it really easy, you can also put them on a piece of parchment paper. That'll make them separate very, very easily, and you'll get a perfect loaf of bread like that. You see how easy this was? The baking of this was tremendously easy. The mixing of it, it just takes a little bit of time. You have to wait for the yeast to do what it's supposed to do. But other than that, it is simplicity itself with so few ingredients that anyone has these sorts of things available. So basically, you should really try to bake your own bread at least occasionally. So the question is, what do these really taste like? Well, let's find out. Here's the typical just household bread, how anybody would have done it. It's done with the simplest flour. It's regular unbleached all-purpose flour. Let's find out. The crumbs set up perfectly. If you would feed this as sandwich bread to your kids, they would think it was just like any other bread, except probably a little bit better. And here's this thirded bread. It's 1/3 rye, 1/3 wheat, 1/3 corn flour, or cornmeal, I should say. And it's much more dense, but, well, it's much more flavorful too. It's got that corn flavor, but not too much. It's got a little bit of rye flavor in there. I like the density. It's not a sandwich bread, but it's certainly a perfectly good table bread. It would go with anything. So easy, so tasty, you should try it.